Hey everybody, this is David, and today we're going to learn how to set up internationalization in a Next.js App Router project. As you probably know, the App Router was released with Next 13. We are actually using Next 14 in this project, which is the latest release. But whether you're using 13 or 14 doesn't really matter. This tutorial will work for either. Now, the primary difference between internationalizing the Pages router versus the App Router is the Pages router had a nice little feature built into it for internationalized routing, which is no longer supported in the app router. So we have to add that internationalized routing in ourselves, which isn't a big deal. As far as the library we're going to be using for the internationalization, we're going to be using i18next, which is a very popular open source JavaScript internationalization library. More specifically, we're going to be using React i18next. You may have heard of Next.js, which was used previously with the Pages router, but unfortunately that library is no longer compatible with the app router and is meant specifically to be used with the Pages router. But the maintainers of i18next actually recommend using React i18next for any app router projects. If you are trying to internationalize a Pages router project, I do recommend using Next.js, and we actually have a tutorial on our channel for doing just that. So check that out if you are using a Pages router setup. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. So I've gone ahead and created a very simple app router project using the create next app command, as you probably did at some point. So all we have here is a home page that I've edited to have a simple header, an example client component that we can check out. It just looks like this. It just renders another header that says have a great day. And then we have a link to another page called About Us that we have right here. And it's a simple little page with a header and an address and a link to go back to the home page. Very simple, and we can take a look at what that looks like, just like that. Very beautiful UI design, I know. All right, so the first thing we want to do is install a few packages to help us with our internationalization. So back in our terminal, I'm going to run npm install i18next, which is the base i18next library, and we're also going to need React i18next, which gives us all the nice little i18next hooks and components, and then another library called i18next resources to backend. So that looks like this, i18next resources to backend. And this is a little i18next plugin that will allow us to load our translation server side. And then lastly, we're going to use a library called next-i18n router. And this library is separate from i18next, but basically what it does is it adds back internationalized routing like we had in the Pages router. So we don't have to worry about building internationalized routing from scratch. If you don't know what that means yet, don't worry, we're going to get into it soon. So let's go ahead and install those. And now we'll go ahead and integrate them. So the first thing we want to do is set up the internationalized routing. So we're going to be setting up next-i18n router. And to do that, we'll go back to our code. And at the root of our project, we will add a file for our config called i18n config. And this is the config specifically for next-i18n router. So in here, we'll define a object called i18n config, and we're going to put two properties in here. The first is locales, and this is a list of locales of languages you want your app to support. So we're going to put en for English, we'll do fr for French, and it for Italian. The second property we're going to add is default locale. And my default locale is going to be English, since that's my native language. And at the bottom here, I will export it with module.exports. And that's all that's needed. So what's going to happen is these locales are going to be prepended to the beginning of the path name. So for example, our About Us page will be located in French at fr/About Us. And then Italian will look just the same with it/About Us. But for our default locale, it's going to keep it at the base path. So our English version of our app will still be at /About Us without en in front of it. If you really want en in front of it, you could do that too, just by adding prefix default true. But for me, I don't really want to prefix the en, so we'll leave that at the default. If you're curious about the other properties available in the config of next-i18n router, you can take a look on the GitHub for that project. So let's go ahead and save that. So next, in order for our locales to appear in the path name, we need to create a dynamic segment in our app directory here. So I'm going to create a new folder, name it locale, And inside of this folder here, I'm going to select all the contents of my app directory and move them into locale. Actually, we do want to keep our favicon outside, so leave that inside of your app folder, outside of the locale directory. All right, great. So the last thing we need to do to set up internationalized routing is create middleware. So what I'm going to do at the root of my project here is create a new file called middleware.js. If you happen to be using the source directory when you set up your project, you want to stick this middleware inside of the source directory. So the middleware.js file is actually part of the Next.js framework. It basically allows us to run code before a request is completed. If you're not familiar with it, go ahead and check it out in the Next.js documentation. But otherwise, you can just go ahead and copy what I'm doing here. It's just the last piece of setup for Next i18n router. So at the top here, I'm going to import a function called i18n router from Next i18n router. And I'm also going to import our config that we declared earlier in i18n config. And then we're going to define our middleware function. So this is the function that runs before each request. And it takes a request as an argument. And in here, we're just going to simply return i18n router. We're going to call this function with the request and our config. So the i18n router function does a few things. The main thing it does, it'll detect the user's preferred language from their browser. That'll be detected based off the accept language header that's set by default on all requests. And then it will redirect them to that preferred language. So that they come to our app in French, it'll redirect them to the /fr route. If they come to us in a language where we don't support it, like Japanese for instance, it'll actually just go back to the default locale and use that one. So in our case, English. So the last thing we need to do in this middleware file is define which requests run this middleware. So for example, if someone tries to request our favicon, which every browser will, we don't want to run it through this routing middleware. We really just want to run it on our pages here, such as our home page and our About Us page. So to define that, we basically will be using a RegEx to define what file requests should be run through the middleware. So what I'm going to do is paste this here, and then we can go over it. So this config, that's a specific variable that Next.js looks at to determine what the middleware goes through, and then it has this matcher property and then the regex of what requests should run through the middleware. So in this case, we're saying don't run the middleware for any of our API routes if we had any. Don't run the middleware for static files. This is basically a catch-all for don't run middleware for anything in our public folder, and then lastly our next configuration folder. So this is unfortunately the simplest way to say that we only want to run the middleware for our specific pages. I'll make sure to paste this regex in the description of this video so that you don't have to try to copy it from your screen. All right, so our internationalized routing is all set up now using Next i18n router. So let's go ahead and start up our dev server and just make sure everything still works with no errors. If I refresh the page, so everything works fine at our base route. We could do /it for Italian, we could do /fr for French, and if we were to type in something random here like ASDF, we go to a nice 404 page. So this is all the internationalized routing that Next i18n router handles for us. So next, let's go ahead and set up i18next to render the correct translations on the page depending on the locale parameter here. So on this page, we'll be using this French locale in the path name to render the French translations. All right, so let's go ahead and set up i18next. We'll go to our page here and we see that we have these headers, links, any text in our app. We need to add as keys in a JSON file that i18next can look up the correct translation depending on the currently selected language. So building and maintaining these JSON files can be quite a pain. They end up getting really lengthy with all of the text in your app. You have to have JSON files for each language you support, and most of the time those other language JSON files are going to be empty until you go out and hire a professional translator somewhere. So maintaining these JSON files manually is kind of the old way of doing it. So what I'm going to be using is a tool called i18nexus. So let's go ahead and check that out. So I have it open here. If you go to i18nexus.com, you can create a quick account like I did. Open the dashboard. All right, so this will make our lives much easier. So basically what i18nexus does is it stores our translations for us. It automatically machine translates them using Google Translate or even DeepL. And then it generates the JSON files for us that we can connect to our app. And then even when you're ready to get to the point of hiring professional translators, you can just invite them to your i18nexus project instead of going off and emailing them your JSON files to translate. So let's get started. So you can see at the top here, I set my project library to i18next because that's the library we're going to be using. And then down here, we want to add all of our supported languages. So that's going to be all of the locales we added in our config earlier. So in my case, I'm going to be adding Italian and French. And we see over here, I have English as my base language. So this is just going to be your default locale that we added to our config earlier. So once you have all your languages here, let's go ahead and click Open Project in the corner. So in here, we're going to start adding the text that is displayed in our app. So I'm going to go back to our code, and I'm going to grab this header here, welcome to my home page, and I'm going to click Add String, and I'm going to paste it here under the value. So the value is the text that's going to be rendered to the end user. The key is what's going to be used to reference this value in your code. So I'm going to call it header. And lastly, we have details. This is to add any notes about the context of the string if you're working with other team members, for instance. It's optional, so we're just going to leave that blank, and I will hit save. So we can see here right after saving that, we can expand this, and we can see we have all of our automatic machine translations that were translated with Google Translate in this case. So that's awesome. We're going to be able to see our app in other languages right away. All right, so before we move on, I want to mention namespaces. So this is a feature in i18next that basically allows us to group translations into different JSON files for organizational purposes, and it allows us to load specific translations per page rather than loading all the translations for our app just to look at one page. So it's very common in Next.js apps to do these namespaces per page. So in our case, this will be our home page. So I'm going to rename this namespace. It's currently called default, and I'm going to call it home. And then it's also common to add another namespace called common that will be used for all different types of text that appear on multiple pages. So I'm going to hit save here. And now we're in our common namespace. So let's go back home and finish adding the text from our home page. So on this page, we render this component example client component. So we'll go ahead and grab this string here. And if you notice, it's a little bit different because we are doing interpolation here, which means we are interpolating a word into the value. So I'm going to copy that. And we will paste it in here. So I'm going to create a new string, paste it here. So for interpolation in i18next, what you do is you put double curly braces around the variable. The variable could be any name that you want, just whatever makes sense for you. I'm going to add a key here. We will call it subheader. So if we open this up, we can notice that i18next smartly knows to not translate the variable name here because this needs to be the same for all languages. Now let's quickly add the rest of these. So we have about us. Oh, one thing to notice about this one is about us appears in two pages. It appears in the about page as well. So I'm going to put this in the common namespace so we can use it on both pages. About us, we'll call this just about us. And then we have, that's it for the home page. And in the about us page, we have our address. And we don't really need to translate the address here. So I'm going to create a new namespace called about us. And I'm going to add our address. I'll call it our address. And then the last string we have is back. So we'll put that here. I'll call it back and save. So if we see up here in our namespaces, I know I did that quickly, but we have three namespaces, the home page, about us page, and one for common. All right, so now that that's all set up, let's go ahead and connect those translations to our app. So back in i18next, I'm going to go to this exports and versions page right here, and I'm going to grab my project API key. So you can click it up here and copy that. I'm going to go back to my project, and at the root here, I'm going to create a .env file to handle my project's environment variables. And I will call this i18next API key, and I'm going to paste my API key there. And then in our terminal, I'm going to install the i18next CLI. So it's just npm install i18next -CLI and -G for global, because you want to install CLIs at the global level. And with that installed, all we have to do now is in our project directory, type i18next pull. And very nicely, it just gave us our locales directory here with all of the translations we just added in i18next. So we click home, we see our translations there, common, about us. So that's awesome. So anytime we update strings in i18next, you just have to run that pull command and you have all of your translations here generated for you. for every language. And one other thing that I like to do is make sure to pull my translations every time I run my dev server or run a build. So you can do that here in your package JSON. Just write i18next pull, and we'll paste that on all of these here. So now every time I start up my dev server, every time I build, every time I run start, it's going to pull the latest translations. And when you do this, make sure to install the i18next CLI with save dev. So that way, no matter what environment you're doing your build in, it has this CLI available to run this command. All right, so now that we have our translations ready, let's go ahead and set up i18next. So we'll set it up in this server component here, since all pages by default are server components. And when dealing with server components, we set up i18next a little bit differently than, say, a normal client-rendered React app. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a helper function to create our i18next instance. So I'll just put it in my app folder here. I'm going to create a new file called i18n.js. So in here, we're going to define a function that initializes our i18next instance to be used in server components. To make it easier, I'm just going to paste it in here and then we can go over it. And I know you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have to copy all this code from his screen. I'm going to go ahead and paste a link to a tutorial that contains all of these code snippets that you can paste into your app. Just to show you what that looks like. It looks just like this here, so you just do a quick copy. So I'll paste this link in the description of this video. So everything going on in here is pretty boilerplate for our setup. We're using this resources to backend plugin from i18next to load our translations from our JSON files. We're initializing the i18next instance and returning it here. So again, not a big deal if you don't fully understand most of this because you haven't used i18next before. This is just a general setup for our use case. All right, so let's go ahead and call this init translation function in our page. So I'm going to open my home page here. And the first thing I want to do is get the current locale that we have in our path name. So we're going to get that from params. And we can get the locale just like this using destructuring. And then in here, I'm going to call init translations. And right now, all we really care about from this init translations function is getting this t function that is returned. So I'm going to say that equals await init translations. And that's imported from our i18n file we just defined. And this t function is used in i18next to basically be called with a key that i18next then takes from your JSON file and renders the correct translation. So in our init translations function, we want to call it with the current locale. And then secondarily, we want to add all of the namespaces that are going to be loaded for this page. So this page, we want to use the home.json file, and we want to use common because remember we have this about us text that we put in common.json. So up in this array, I'm going to put home and common. So we have this function set up so that the first namespace in this array is going to be the default namespace, and we'll see what that means in a minute here. All right, so with that set up, let's go ahead and render our translations. So I'm going to remove this text here, and instead we are going to call the t function with the key for this text, which in this case is header. That is what we named the key in i18next for this text. And then down here we have our about us text in this link, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, t. But this time it's a little bit different because we're getting the key from the common namespace instead of our home namespace. And in this case, as I said earlier, the home namespace is our default. So the difference between using your default namespace and a non-default namespace is that with these namespaces, you have to include the namespace in the key like this. You just type common, colon, and this key was called about us. And that's all you have to do. So the header here doesn't have to include the home namespace because it's our default namespace because it's the first namespace in the array. All right, perfect. All right, so let's run our dev server and see if this works. I'm gonna do npm run dev. And it downloaded the translations because we set that up in our package JSON earlier. And we could see here, we have welcome to my home page. So we're on the English route right now. So that's why we're seeing the English text. And for some reason, our about us text isn't rendering. So you know that i18next can't find the key in your JSON file if it renders the key rather than rendering the text. So I'm going to double check in i18next what, oh yeah, look at that. I did a typo. I wrote abus us. So I'm going to change that to about us. And now to get that updated key in our code, I'm just going to restart the server since it pulls our translations whenever we start it. But normally you'll probably just want to run i18next pull in another tab and it'll do the same thing. And now let's look at our common JSON file. Okay, now we have the correct key, and I'm going to go back to our app and refresh. And boom, there's the About Us text we're looking for. So the reason that we're viewing the English page right now is because my browser language is set to English. So the locale detector inside of i18n router that we set up in our middleware is sending me to my preferred language. So if my browser was set to French, it would send me to /fr. And we have our page that looks like this. So as you can see, it's rendering the Google translations that i18next has generated for us. So that's awesome. So obviously the last thing we have to do on this page is render the translations for this client component. So let's see how we do that. All right, so all of our translations right now are loaded on the server side in this server side component. And in order to get them to all of the nested client components in this page, we're going to use a provider. So this provider will be set up once per page to provide translations to all of the nested client components. So over here in my components folder, doesn't really matter where you put it, I'm just going to call this one translations provider.js. And here we're going to use the i18next provider. And once again, I'm going to copy from that tutorial. I'm going to paste in the description. You can find it in the translations provider section, and we will quickly go over it here. So first off, this translations provider is a client component because the i18next provider from React i18next can only be used in client components. And then we simply just create an instance with i18next. We call our init translations function again, but this time what we're doing is we're actually passing the resources, and resources are basically the term for translations in i18next. They call them resources. So we're going to pass the translations into this provider as props. We're going to call init translations, and our init translations function is set up to just load these resources without having to go and pull them from our JSON file. So we're just directly passing the translations directly to this function. And then we are rendering this provider with our i18next instance. So pretty boilerplate. Once again, you're not going to have to edit this or anything like that. So let's go ahead and put it to use. So the first thing I'm going to do is also pull the resources from the object that's returned from init translations. And then we're going to wrap this whole page with our translations provider. So this is from the provider file that we just created. And I'm going to do that and wrap this whole page with the translations provider. And some people get a little confused and think this page is turning into a client component since we're wrapping it with the client component. But that's not how it works with server components. This will still be rendered as a server component, and this will just have an effect on the client components in the page. So that's one of the cool things with server and client components. So if you recall, in our translations provider, we need to pass the locale, namespaces, and the resources. So first thing I'll do is put the resources that we just destructured out, and then our locale, and then lastly our namespaces. So I don't really want to copy this twice. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set a variable up here, and I'll call it i18n namespaces, and paste that. So that way we can just reuse this and edit the namespaces in one place rather than multiple places. And that's it. So I want to reiterate that we only use this provider once per page. So it should just wrap the whole page one time and not need it again. All right, so with that set up, we can now translate any client components on our page. So I'm going to go to this example client component that we're rendering. And here we can just use i18next like you can in any client-side React app. So at the top here, I'm going to import a hook called useTranslation from React i18next. And at the top here, I'm going to destructure out the T function from useTranslation. And now we can just translate any text on the page. So in this case, we called this one subheader. So the key is subheader. And because we're using interpolation on this one, the second argument should be your interpolator. So if you recall, back in i18nexus, on our home namespace, we are using the variable username. So it happens to be the same as what we're using here. So I will just write username and save. So if you've used React i18next before in a normal client-side rendered app, you'll notice this is exactly the same setup here in a client component in the app router. You can use the same hooks and components and just render the translation like this. So once you get this initial setup with the translations provider, everything is quite easy to use while you're developing. So let's go ahead and check out our app now. And there we go. We are now looking at the French version of our client component and the whole page. So I'm going to go ahead and do IT and Italian works great as well, and back to English. There we go. All right, so we still have our About Us page that we also need to translate as well. So back in our code, we're going to use this same setup in our About Us page right here. So instead of walking you through the same exact thing for the sake of time, I'm going to use magic video editing to make this work immediately. And go. Magic. So we're all set up here now. So you'll notice it's the exact same thing. We just are using the About Us namespace instead of the common namespace. We're using the common About Us key here and just rendering a few other translations. So now our About page is translated. So if I go to /it/About Us, you can see here we are translating all the text. So one thing you'll notice here is we are on the Italian page, but if I click this link to go back, we are back to English. And the reason for that is the i18n router is using my browser language to determine the correct language for me to be on, which is normally fine because if I land on the incorrect language, I'd prefer to be redirected to my native language. But there's always a case where a visitor will want to change the language to a different language that's different from their browser language. So we want them to be able to control this. So let's add a language selector to our website. All right, so back to the code. So with the next i18n router library, if we want to override the automatic detected language, we can use a cookie. So it'll use the cookie language instead of the browser language in that case. So what we're going to do is create a drop-down that sets this cookie with the selected language. So let's create this drop-down component. So in our components here, I'm going to create a new file called languagechanger.js. And in the tutorial in this description, you can copy a nice little ready to go component for this language changer, and we can go over it in a second here. So all that's going on here is we have a select drop-down with all of our languages. Feel free to translate these ones as well if you want. And all we're doing here is on change, we're getting the new locale here. And right here, all we're doing is creating a cookie. In this case, we are setting the cookie to last for 30 days, but feel free to set that to whatever you want. And you'll notice the name of the cookie is next locale. That is the cookie name that next i18n router uses to read the locale from. And then down here, all we're doing is we are just redirecting to that new locale. So this is just basically saying if we're at the base route at our default language, it's just adding the new locale into the path name. And if we're on a different locale, it's just replacing the locale in the path name with the new one. So once again, this is just pretty boilerplate. The only thing you might want to change around is maybe the days or how you prefer your cookie to be set up. So let's go ahead and add this language changer component to our home page. So back in our home page here, I'm just going to stick it right down here below the link, language changer. And that's imported from our file we just created, and save. And back in our app, there we have it. So I've already added a few styles to this select input, so yours might look a little uglier, but here it is. So I can click on it, go to Italian, and boom, we're at the /it page. If I click this link, we stay in Italian because the cookie has been set and is overriding the automatic detection with next i18n router. So your user can use this to change to whatever language they prefer. All right, so we now have a fully internationalized app. So one last thing I want to mention is back in our code, you'll notice that in our links, we're just using the base route in all of the hrefs, meaning we're not putting in the fr or the it inside of the href, because basically what's going on is the i18n router function in our middleware is redirecting us to the correct language, regardless of what we have going on in here. So this is obviously an easier developer experience than interpolating the language into every href. But for more SEO conscious developers, it is good to have the current locale inside of the href. We're not going to do that here, but if you want to do that, it would be easy enough. All you would do is create a helper function that wraps all of these hrefs that interpolates the language code into the path name. And getting the current locale you probably saw inside of the language changer is pretty simple. You just use the use translation hook from i18next, and you can just take the i18n.language to get the current language. So whether or not you want to implement that is up to your use case. All right, so that's it. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and if you have any questions, go ahead and leave a comment and we'll get back to you. I know there's quite a lot of configuration to set up in the beginning, but once that's set up, it's pretty easy developing from there on out. So like and subscribe if you found this useful, and we will see you next time.